When I moved to the UK, I was in the middle of my PhD. And what happened is, to sustain myself, I was working in the charity sector until the charity I was working for ran out of funds, couldn't find another job, had to pay the rent. Landlord decides to increase the rent. And this is, how I became homeless. And I had to squat for, I think, 2 years before I was able to climb back up the social ladder. But would I have been able to get out of homelessness by myself? And the answer is completely no. This is almost mission impossible.
Hello and welcome to Protean View. I'm Riyadh as always, and with me as co-host is Mohammed Bushra, our managing editor at Muftah. We're joined for this episode by William Barylo. He's a soon-to-be former sociologist at the University of Warwick in the UK, having recently announced his departure from academia. And he's a visual artist with an interest in neoliberalism as a life form. And that's exactly why we invited him onto the show, to talk about that. He has a new book out with Oxford University Press titled Muslims in the Neoliberal Empire, and he also has a growing YouTube channel that distills his academic work into more accessible content. We discuss quite a lot about William's journey, both personal and academic, and how it led him to the topic of neoliberalism. In a moment, you'll hear that discussion, but first I want to say a quick thank you to our supporters on Substack and Patreon for helping make this episode possible. And I invite listeners of the show to consider joining our community on Substack at muftah.org and Patreon at patreon.com/proteanview, which you can do for as low as $5 a month. To help us keep this show running, please do follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and wherever else you find your podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at muftah.org to stay updated on the latest from us. Thanks for listening and for your support. And here now is our conversation with William Barylo. Do you mind if we start with a question about definitions?
Sure.
Can you define neoliberalism for us and tell us why you chose it as your subject of study?
To make it as simple as possible, neoliberalism and the way I use it is more from the sociological perspective, because from an economics perspective, an economist would say something different. But the way I frame it is that it is an economic system, free market that regulates itself by competition, no state intervention. And the thing is, since the 80s, this economic system has morphed into a way of life, an ethics, to paraphrase David Harvey, who's written extensively about it, which means that we are globally now living our lives as if it was the free market, which means that we're competing against each other. Everyone is on their own. It's everyone for themselves. And the rule is making money out of anything and everything. No morals, no ethics, no faith, no beliefs, unless you can, of course, commodify it and make money out of it. And this sociologically has led people to be more and more atomized. There's, I would say, less solidarity than we used to see decades ago. People are more individual-centered. And this is what has allowed, I would say, most of the excesses that we see nowadays.
Yeah, that's clear. I do also want to ask you to tell us why you use neoliberalism and not capitalism to describe the phenomenon that you're concerned with here. Why not just talk about capitalism? Because for someone that's maybe not as familiar, they're hearing your descriptions and they say, that's just capitalism. What's the difference here?
So neoliberalism, some people call it late-stage capitalism, because capitalism is the foundations of neoliberalism. You make us try to grow, make money as much as you can, increase revenue. Neoliberalism defines a very particular set of rules attached to it, where actually there's kind of no rules anymore. It's make money the way you want with what you want. So it is, I would say, to try to make it simple, it's a kind of philosophy attached to capitalism. Grow, but forego any rules and regulations, compete with each other, and good luck in a way. This is how I would say it.
I know that you talk in the book and on your YouTube channel as well, you talk about some of the personal dimensions to the work that you pursue. Can you maybe get into that a little bit? Tell us where your personal life intersects with your academic work, and specifically how it led you to studying neoliberalism as it pertains to Muslims in the West.
So when it comes to my academic research, most of my research questions have been informed by my personal life. And until very recently, you know, I wouldn't make a distinction between what was my personal life and what was my research, because in my mind, why I chose sociology is not only to understand the things around me that were happening to me or to my friends, my family, but I chose it as, I would say, almost a way of life, which means that this is a research that I've been doing even when I wasn't employed by a university, when I was jobless, when I was homeless, because that was, I wanted to document and answer these questions in my personal life. So the way neoliberalism, I would say, has impacted my life is, there's so many layers to it, from, how I was raised as a kid, as a teenager, how my parents put this emphasis on making money to be happy. This is what they pushed me. This is why, they wanted me to be either a banker or a GP, a lawyer, all these kind of professions, which are, from their understanding, were mainly defined by, making money. And for them, it was the key to happiness. So this is, of course, yeah, things didn't go to plan with my parents. But then later on, when I moved to the UK, I was faced by the realities of the job market, especially the academic job market, where, again, big disillusion. When I was a student, I was sold this narrative that if you want a steady job, even if it's not paid much, but a good and steady job, do your PhD and become an academic. And it was a very noble thing to do in the eyes of people in my cohort, because, it was about sharing knowledge, learning, and potentially having an impact on the world around you. But when I got to the UK and started trying to get jobs after my PhD, this is when I realized that no, this is not what it used to be. Now we're talking about academia as an industry, like so many other fields, and that tells a lot. The fact that, you know, simple facts such as now academics are so underpaid compared to if you go to professional services at university. I often, I find it funny, the contrast between my wife, who's only got a BA in history and works at university professional services and earns more than twice as much as what I was earning after, I don't know what, like 10 or more years of study, like PhD, and having this like grant and stuff. It's just crazy. So you understand that universities are not for knowledge anymore. Now it's about student experience. It's about, ratings, and the way, you carve your way to, if you really, really want to work in the academic, as an academic in the higher education sector. Now, back in the days, I saw the degradation of the conditions. Back then, you were almost guaranteed to have a job after your PhD. Then maybe 10 years later, it was, well, you should have maybe one or two publications under your belt, having attended 2 or 3 conferences 10 years later. So publications, conferences, grants, like tens of thousands of pounds or dollars of funding. Like, and even that doesn't work anymore. Now it's about who you know and who is willing to give you a place. It's, and I saw it when I got this massive grant from the British Academy, which I believe is still the highest and most competitive grant you can get for early careers in Europe, and which was designed to give people a permanent job afterwards. And I know so many people from my cohort and even before who are struggling with precarious temporary contracts now. So the system is completely broken. And I can go on with more and more examples in all fields of life. It's just become horrible.
So how did you go from being homeless to getting a PhD and studying Muslims and their connection to neoliberalism? Spell that out for us.
So I believe how I got out of homelessness is 100% luck or destiny or whatever you want to call it. I consider this as a proper miracle. Because for context, I started my studying sociology in 2009. So this is when I started my master's. And what the work I've been doing until now is a continuation of this journey. So when I moved to the UK, I was in the middle of my PhD. And what happened is, to sustain myself, I was working in the charity sector until the charity I was working for ran out of funds, couldn't find another job, had to pay the rent. Landlord decides to increase the rent. And this is, how I became homeless. And I had to squat for, I think, 2 years before I was able to climb back up the social ladder. But the only thing that took me out of homelessness is literally getting married, meeting my wife and moving in with her because she had a job at the time. And so we had and also because her parents allowed us to stay in one of their flats, in one of their properties. But, there's so many factors. It doesn't depend on me. So I always, look back at this journey and a question, would I have been able to get out of homelessness by myself? And the answer is completely no. No, I don't know for how many years I would have had to work, even if I got eventually a university position at the end, how many years I would have had to work to get out of it. This is almost mission impossible. And, it's just crazy when you realize that you live in a system that absolutely doesn't provide any safety nets for people, whatever is their backgrounds, their achievements, their qualifications. It's just very scary.
To bring it back somewhat to definitions, metacolonialism is a concept that plays an important role in your book, including in the title. So could you perhaps explain the concept and how it aids us in understanding our current circumstance? And also, what does the concept do to add to understanding compared to other related terms, colonialism, post-colonialism, decolonialism, etc.?
So metacolonialism, to think about it in the simplest way possible, it's colonization that is not tangible or not visible anymore to some extent. And it is a colonization which I like to compare it to stage 4 cancer, where you talk about metastasis. It is a colonization where people who were historically oppressed can become oppressors and vice versa. It's a colonization that is almost eating itself because it contaminates even now the centers of power it emanated from. So this is a term coined by psychology professor Hussein Bulhan, who is the founder of the Frans Fanon University in Hargeisa in Somaliland. And he came with the term after studying mental health care in Sudan and how mental health practitioners in Sudan were just copying and pasting Eurocentric frameworks in mental health care, and how it was completely disconnected from the needs of the people of Sudan and the very particular context of the country. So this is a stage of colonization that he argues comes after, we had the colonization, the occupation of lands, the neocolonialism, when the empires dissolved themselves in a way, but then former colonies were ruled by people serving the interests of the former empires. So this is neocolonialism. And metacolonialism is what we have now, where there is no clear distinction between colonized and colonizer anymore, where everyone can, and very likely is, playing a role in the oppression of others, even without knowing it. because like how global the system has become.
When you talk about the globality or the globalness and obscurity of metacolonialism, how similar is the concept to like Gramsci's idea of hegemony? Are we just talking about a form of hegemony here when we talk about metacolonialism, or is it something else?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, this is like a hegemonic colonization. It affects all spheres of life, every possible sector, whether we're talking about environment, healthcare, justice, economics, politics, culture, like everything.
And the hegemonic structure we're talking about here is neoliberalism?
It is one of the many forms or weapons, I would say, of metacolonialism.
Could you say more?
The thing is, I like to think about these systems as ecosystems where everything is interconnected. And when it comes to neoliberalism, we saw that this is something that emerged from the field of economics, but has slowly moved and seeped into almost all spheres of life, because it affects not only the way people trade and spend and receive money, but the way people think, the way people learn, and the way people have access to, let's say, healthcare, education, information, and many, many other things. And these structures are also in these, like the historical centers of power, so America, are also contaminated by things like misogyny, white supremacy, and so on and so on. And what has happened is that all these different forces are intertwined, interwoven together to create the situations that we are experiencing right now.
How do you approach decolonization in response to this idea of metacolonialism or metacolonization that you spell out? I mean, if metacolonialism isn't simply geographic or simply a military phenomenon, but something less tangible and more ubiquitous, what does decolonization look like in the face of it?
It's really, really messy, to be honest. And I'm still struggling myself to understand, how can I play my role in decolonizing myself and the general, we say, decolonial journey? Because when we think about it, to provide concrete examples, it is, not only through the information we consume, the education I received, but, it can be things which may seem as innocent as, or as mundane, more exactly, as the banking system we're using. How do we pay for things? How do we consume things? Things do we buy? How is, I don't know, this computer made? With which components sourced in which country? With what kind of labor? Same like clothing, everything. And you realize that it's, my first reaction was like, how can we ever like make a move? Because it's so around us in our everyday lives, in almost everything we wear, everything we touch, everything we eat, everything we see. It's super, super difficult. But reading from decolonial scholars, when we try to understand, when this is again my opinion, how I understand decolonization. So Walter Mignolo, he talks about, first of all, delinking, which in a way I understand it as divesting. How can we divest from the hegemonies we are all almost drowning into, So, because decolonial movement has been very much, first of all, to do with knowledge, decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing the information we receive, and decentering Europe and America as the, between quote marks, objective, neutral authorities on the matters. But then can you translate this in your everyday life? So this is something which, if you've heard of BDS, it would be very familiar. Like, which brands should we boycott in a way, to make it very, very simple? What brands are producing things in a way which I find ethically acceptable, and which are not, which are, invested in like some kind of oppression or with like very oppressive business practices, extractive, exploitative business practices. And, this is something just like a diet. You cannot go cold turkey very easily. This is something that takes time. And I know I've been writing about this for right now, like 10, 15 years, and I'm still, on the learning journey. What can I detach myself from? What are the things I can live without? And what are the alternatives I can choose? Because after the process of delinking, so divesting, separating ourselves from anything which has to do with oppression, there is also the work of reconstruction. How do we then build an alternative lifestyle which is more grounded into what we want to see in the long term? And again, that's a learning journey, trying to figure out, mapping the territory. What are the brands, the initiatives I can rely on, I can invest in? Yeah, I think it's a lifelong process.
I think for a lot of people, when they think about decolonization, they're rightly or wrongly thinking about recoverability, recovering lost pasts, recovering lost lands. But the way that you're talking about it, it sounds like you're primarily thinking about it as a way to imagine possible futures. It's not just about recoverability. It's about, for example, thinking past capitalism, past neoliberalism. Is that right?
Yes, it is, because my argument is that one of the main weapons, one of the main tools of pressure of metacolonialism, so imperialism, whatever you want to call it, or this hegemonic universe we're in, is to render its victims pessimistic, making us think that there is no alternative, there is no hope. The only way is to play the game of the system. But from the initiatives and the people I have followed in my journey, I realized that no, it's not, that's absolutely not true. We are not trapped. There is hope. The question is, how do we, first of all, not only journey towards these hopes, these ideals, but how do we remain, I would say, optimistic? Because if we lose our ability to dream, our ability to imagine that something else is possible, this is where metacolonialism wins. This is where white supremacy, neoliberalism wins. This is if they make us believe that there is no other way out, this is how they win. Right? This is the first step, is to win the psychological battle, thinking that no, even if we feel that we are not in a position where we have much power, much influence, much room to change things around us, there is always a possibility.
I don't think there's a shortage of people in the world who want to believe or sincerely believe that alternatives to the current system are possible. But their efforts to push against the system or move beyond it are often just repurposed, commodified, turned into spectacle, metabolized by the system, right? I'm going to start a punk rock band. Okay, well then it just becomes commercialized. Oh, I've become some kind of revolutionary. Okay, but then my face gets plastered on a T-shirt and sold, in a department store somewhere. That aspect of contemporary life does seem to be inescapable. And to just bring one thinker into the conversation here, Mark Fisher talks about how it's almost easier to imagine the end of the world sometimes than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And he calls this capitalist realism. But you're saying, no, we can't let go of that hope. We can't kind of resign ourselves to this idea that there is no beyond. But I guess my question here, this long-winded question I'm trying to get to is imagining enough? Because as I said, there's no shortage of people that are attempting at the very least to imagine a future, but is imagining really enough?
Of course not. It's, as I mentioned, I think it's a first step. Because then, the question is, like, how do we actually build things? How do we make these alternatives work? And the sad reality is it's super, super hard. I have been following organizations which I believe do an amazing job. But, 10 years down the line, now almost 15 years down the line, they are still struggling. People, they doing unpaid work, people struggling to find funds to sustain, paying the bills, the rent, organizing things. Sometimes people just quit in the gears of modern life. If like people have then kids, it is a whole other bunch of struggles that they're facing. So can they maintain their commitment to the cause as much as when they were, without kids or single? And a lot of people gets, almost eaten, I would say, by the system, because again, we don't have the superstructures that enable us to continue this work because of the constraints put by these hegemonies, the financial realities, social realities, and so on. So it is hard work, but it is necessary work.
So from what you describe, this kind of ethic of opting out, you also mention examples in chapters 4 and 5 on grassroots mental health initiatives and environmentalist collectives. You acknowledge that a lot of these gestures are anti-elitist in the orientation, but somewhat modest in really trying to opt out of certain dimensions of hegemonic reality, while sometimes even perhaps giving in to others. These commodified notions often of Western cultural significance. Do you think that this is enough? Because there's something underwhelming about all of this. I understand it feeds into this notion of navigating that you're talking about, but a critic might come and say, well, this kind of sounds tantamount to the kind of cynical recycle and drive a hybrid mantra that we often hear at the end of high flying theory, and then in the end, what we can actually do is very limited. And we're kind of limited and hamstrung in terms of our options. How do we navigate this?
I don't have a clear-cut answer to this question, because I think we are still witnessing the building of these alternatives, in the sense that, from what I feel, is that in the past decades, a lot of the work when it comes to wider decolonial movements has been on the resistance dimension, naming what is harming people, deconstructing all these structures, so we can, build a map of what is attacking us in a way. It is only very, very recently, I mean, to some exceptions, of course, that people have been focusing on further dimensions of, when, for example, we talk about healing from the wounds that that this society, how the society is harming us. And then, building is, again, it is a whole other step, because how is it possible for people to start building if there's no healing taking place, if people are still broken or in survival mode? So I have especially witnessed this in the past years, where there's been an increase in awareness about mental health, the simple things, what is PTSD, what is generational trauma, and so on and so on. And when it comes to the average person around me, some people are still, I would say, getting acquainted with these terms and realizing that, oh, maybe the way my life has turned is because, my parents didn't have the tools to be good parents. And maybe, I should change the way I see things when it comes to, my relationships with my family, my friends, maybe my children, so I don't pass on the generational trauma. So people are still realizing. And when it comes to building, one big problem is, again, because lots of the people in the field don't have the resources to start things, and unless, of course, they play into the system, and then therefore have to compromise with their values, their morals, their ethics, getting government grants and stuff, that, you have to tick the right boxes for that still. So it is very, very difficult to do it independently. And some organizations and initiatives are able to do it, but at the very moment, it's still, I would say, a matter of luck. Having around the right people who can provide or connect you with the right resources. Because the people who have the resources, whether it is connections, whether it is money, whether it is knowledge, for many of them, they are not in this mindset where, how can I use my resources in a way where it can help people progress in this journey, and I can actually play my role in the bigger scheme of things.
Right. The through line of neoliberalism obviously manifests throughout your book in different ways. Often you talk about the construction of a certain kind of consumer culture that disseminates through social media and other means and makes people compliant in a certain kind of way. Another dimension perhaps is incentivizing people to essentially sell out or opt into oppressive frameworks, whether we're talking about CVE or other kind of securitized measures and policies. Is this just a case of kind of keeping people poor so that they kind of have no way out but to assimilate into the system in these kinds of harmful ways, or what exactly is going on?
Yeah, the way the system is geared is definitely about controlling people and controlling the census in the sense that, we were sold at school and at uni that, governments are here for the greater good, for the welfare of the people. But no, when you look at things from a, cold business perspective, governments are here to manage populations. This is a management exercise. And the logic they apply to their people is, no, they don't have the welfare of the people in mind. By definition, it is about, money flux. It is about being able to control a territory, being able to control the economy, being able to control people. And by extent, it means, thought, it means like social behaviors, like everything. It is an exercise in control. And the best way to control people, because, who needs to be controlled when you think from the perspective of a government? It is the people who are, who are marginalized, the people who are, the more at risk of provoking social unrest, while the most unhappy because of the government policies. But what is the cheaper option? Is it solving their actual problems? How to put food on the table, how to provide the kids with a good education? The cheapest option and the easiest has always been controlling. You policing, you criminalize people, you tell them what to like, how to speak, how to look, how to behave, and making sure they comply. And this is something which I found it most obvious when it comes to counter-extremism policies, which have emerged after 9/11 and 7/7. The way the tactics of the counter-extremism industry have morphed from this very antagonistic house arrests, house raids, imprisonment, which are still going on, by the way. But when you look at how think tanks have evolved, there was then the creation of this Islamophobia industry, all these business owners, media firms, philanthropists pouring literally millions and millions of dollars for media outlets, for universities to propagate a certain message about Muslims. And then what we saw in the UK is how think tanks literally engineer fake Muslim organizations, fake Muslim media outlets, where all the employees were in fact white people who didn't have a clue about what Islam is and how Muslims live, to propagate a certain narrative. And later on, I think that this is the utmost evolution at the moment. The latest update is about curating the social media sphere, like cherry picking certain influencers and putting them on the front of the stage under the spotlight to propagate, again, the same narratives, or sponsoring certain clubs which pretend to be grassroots, or in fact, are just, government vetting machines. If you go there, they're gonna give you like a stamp, just like we can talk about the Muslim Leadership Initiative in the US. How if you're Muslim and you want to, let's say, get a job for the New York Times or get into politics, this is you have to get their stamp of approval with all the strings attached.
So another thing that you discuss is, in reaction to a lot of these conditions, you have the appearance of phenomena such as the alt-right Muslim manosphere, for example. And of course, there's lots of different strands to this. You highlight that they often define themselves in opposition to a long laundry list of different things, some of which we may disagree on, women pursuing a career being an example, some of which we may disagree on the reasons for opposing, such as liberalism, and then some of which we may kind of unreservedly agree on: counter-extremism, funding, police informants, genocides in Palestine of the Uyghurs, the Rohingya, etc. Does this kind of spectrum of agreement and disagreement speak to the reason why you reference bell hooks' concept of comrades in struggle when discussing ways in which to kind of understand and interact with the alt-right bros? Do you see something salvageable there, or what exactly is going on, or how do we understand this phenomenon?
Salvageable is itself a term which I'm not sure I would use, because everyone's different, and you cannot necessarily tell if someone can change or will change or is willing to change, because I can dive deeper into these dimensions, but having interviewed people who are sympathetic to their views, who embrace their worldviews, and having analyzed through digital ethnography the life journey of some of the main actors in the field, I sometimes feel really sorry for them, in the sense that I feel that these are people who, I could just imagine them being one of my friends, or like this, like a relative in my family who had all these kind of frustrations, but doesn't know how to process them, and then turns towards the most simplistic binary narratives that tell them that they can fix things, but they just don't know better. Although argue that for some of them they should be held accountable, because I don't know how you as a grown adult can propagate these kind of destructive messages without realizing, like, you wielding so much influence, because some of them, they have in the hundreds of thousands of followers, if not millions. But when it comes to the average person I have met in my fieldwork, these are people who have a lot of frustrations, but also a lot of potential to do things if the right way, if they are given the right tools. So instead of, and also, when it comes to antagonizing people, this is something I very much agree with when it comes to people who are in positions of power, people who have a public presence and are doing harm at an unfathomable scale. These guys need to be stopped at some point, and people need to realize that what they are saying is really harmful. But when it comes to the average person, I really want to, just like bell hooks, the way I understand it, considers them as comrades in struggle. These are people who could do a lot of good for the society, a lot of good around them, but they just need to, they don't have the support they have needed at some point in life to take this or this other turn. And this is how I want to see it.
To maybe press against this a little bit, the people who are often immediately in the firing range of these kinds of figures often immediately feel the harm that they bring. So primarily, really, Muslim women are usually kind of the target for a lot of the discourse. And often they're the first to call these people out, and the first to be kind of on the receiving end of the accusations, whether from these people themselves or other people who will say, hey, why are you going after them? They're well-meaning. Couldn't you do it in a better way? And there's this kind of then a sort of policing of sentiment which happens. So how do we navigate that? Because obviously I think often there's a need to kind of center those voices as well, who usually raise the alarm bells first.
Yeah, completely. Can you just clarify your question? Because
So I guess I mean that it's fine. I understand where you're coming from when you say, these people themselves are struggling. Maybe they need the right tools. That's potential for good if they knew what they were doing. But it almost seems that we are quick to absolve and work past, and already talk about potential positives when sometimes real harm has already been done. And the people who have warned about this or who have complained about the harm that has been done to them often feel they're being silenced. And again, more often than not, it's Muslim women who we're rushing to kind of try to salvage or do good for these alt-right bros and talk about potential good that they may bring before we've even redressed the actual harm that often Muslim women have suffered as a result of this discourse running rampant.
yes, so yeah, I completely agree with you, and this is why I'm making a distinction between the average person who sympathize with their views and some of the main actors of the movement who have hundreds of thousands or like millions of followers who have this kind of power and influence. So I completely agree in the sense that we need to hold these people to account. We need to stop them in their tracks. We need to also raise awareness with people that about the dangers and the harms their messages vehiculate. But the thing is, what I've observed is it is extremely difficult to change people because one thing is, of course, these people need to be held to account. But the other question is, how do we stop people from following them and resharing what they post or these kind of narratives? Because they wouldn't have gotten in these positions of power and influence if people didn't support them with all the likes and follows and subscribes, of course. So in my, I always wonder how do you change that? And again, when it comes to change, there is no simple answer. It is important for people who are, community organizers and who disagree with these views and see the harm in these views to raise awareness, raise the alarm bells about it. But that's not enough because if we want to dive a little bit into neuropsychology, what happens with this alt-right movement is just a form of tribalism, which means that, I always I always find, people respond to their arguments by referencing religious texts, statistics, facts, numbers. But the problem is you cannot reason these people with facts and statistics and numbers. It's because what happens is very much at an emotional level. People are drawn to these people because of the symbolic and the narrative of empowerment. People feel disempowered. These guys seem to have a very simple solutions for that. And people don't think twice. It's very much similar to these get-rich-quick schemes. And we've seen in the past years how so many of these like materialistic narratives, get rich quick, like get a second wife and stuff, is linked to these alt-right frameworks. It is like a very emotional response, and it's very hard to reason people out of something like that. We have to use different tools. Which tools? I'm not sure yet, because I've witnessed people stuck into very harmful behaviors in my personal life among my friends, in things such as domestic violence and stuff. And when it comes to even on a personal level with people who really trust me and who I really trust, it's extremely difficult for someone to change because first of all, they need to be aware of what they're doing. They need to be aware of the harm they're doing or, the kind of narratives they believe in. And once only they are aware, they can think about changing. But for them, just to get on this very first step of awareness, it is extremely, extremely difficult for some people.
I did have a question I wanted to ask, kind of bringing it back to an earlier part of the discussion, because I don't think we properly unpacked this. Briefly, could you just tell us why it's of interest to study or even think about the effects of neoliberalism specifically on the Muslim community. We're all affected in one way or another. It's obviously just not Muslims. But what's so unique or perhaps special about the effects of neoliberal life in Muslim communities? I have a follow-up to that, but I'll let you answer that first, and then I'll take it from there.
Sure. So my study of neoliberalism, specifically when it comes to Muslim circles, is just related to my personal journey and how I was first shocked by the paradoxes when you, for example, you attend charity dinner, you work in the charity sector, or you attend khutbah at the mosque, or you're hanging out in your ISOC or MSA in the US, and you have these discourses which are very much the antithesis of neoliberalism and these hegemonies. But then you see the same people who are buying into these harmful narratives. And for me, back then, it was a way for me to try to decipher what's going on here. How do people reconcile these opposing views? And, understand through people's biographical journeys, understand through, social economic factors, what's going on. Is that we, why is it that we have this a beautiful message in Islam about, all these guidelines, this how to build a just and fair framework for ourselves and the whole of society, and people who are doing the opposite. We can dive deeper. It's just like simple and basic human psychology. But for me, it was you try to resolve, where does this paradox come from, and how does it affect us, and what can we do about it to escape it or fix it if possible.
I'm curious to know whether you think, I'm just trying to figure out how to frame this question, really. Some Muslims in the West think very much in terms of West versus Islam. They really participate almost eagerly in this framing. And it's hard to notice, it's rather hard not to notice that for a lot of these same Muslims, they don't seem to direct their critical energies toward neoliberalism or late capitalism, for example. So they will critique to no end this amorphous idea of the West, and of course juxtapose Islam to it, and identify their problems as somehow existing at the intersection of this conflict between the West and Islam. But then they'll go and, in particular Western Muslims, they will go and, make quote unquote hijrah. There's a lot to unpack there as well, but, they'll migrate to, let's say, the United Arab Emirates, right, to Dubai. And with no sense of irony, with no sense of awareness of they'll just move there and say, here it is now, I've escaped the West. I guess my question is, why is it that you think a lot of Muslims are more drawn to this dichotomy between the West and Islam rather than thinking about some of the more urgent material issues with regard to late capitalism and neoliberalism?
Yeah, there's many, many layers to unpack here. But I think this is a combination of, again, colonial frameworks that have steeped into language and the will to simplify things, because this is like I said, as a human thing, we want things to be simple to understand. So when it comes to this dichotomy between the West and Islam, this is a narrative that's born in the colonial times, like in the 19th century. This is where people started to use the term the Islamic world versus the West, opposing, the East as being this uncivilized place, or and so on and so on. The term Islam, the expression Islamic world itself, comes from the colonial masters, and because I guess we've been steeped into this system for generation, now we are at a time where it's almost normal for people to not question, the Islamic world. Like, which country in the world is even Islamic? Like, what does it mean? And because of the oppression of Muslims in Europe, in America, people have romanticized a certain idea of the East, like Muslims have romanticized a certain idea of the East, which not only fits this colonial framework, but is also a way for them to escape to a certain imagined land, a certain imagined time. The way people romanticize the golden ages of Islam. When you had this TV series Ertugrul made in Turkey, like the hype around it, because it talks to this imaginary. Once we were powerful, once we were in power, once we were rulers, and which contrasts with the West, the narrative served by the West of like Muslims being poor, immigrants, terrorists, and so on and so on. So of course, that's really that this is a way of for people to raise the self-esteem. But again, because sadly, not everyone has the tools to understand the actual dynamics of the world and realize that, moving to Dubai is not really escaping this the colonial framework that has is also in power in the Euro America. People just don't realize. They just see, an arid land somewhere in the east with lots of halal food options, which says to, live by the rules of Islam as they understand it. And, people don't think twice about, what's going on in the UAE, that, these guys are funding a genocide currently happening in Sudan. There's so much complexity, but I will also say that we sadly live in a time that doesn't, in an era that doesn't give people not only the tools to understand all these dynamics, but also the time to just, sit and reflect. Like, what am I doing? What are the choices I am making actually mine? The things I like, the things, question our choices, question very simple things such as, our purpose in life. What is, what am I doing here? What is, we're not given the time to reflect on this because of people are put in survival mode, the 9 to 5, all the bills, the rent to pay, plus all the problems on top of that. We talked about mental health and stuff. This is, it's almost as if the society has put us in prisons by trapping us and constantly trying to chase, one atom of stability, one atom of, I would say, normality. It just, it's, we try to catch it, but it flows through our hands like, sand. It's a vicious circle, really.
Yeah, and I always do wonder, especially when I think about the example of Dubai, what it is that they're trying to escape, because they're not escaping a blueprint of Western life. They're certainly not escaping neoliberal life. They're not escaping late capitalism. They're actually migrating to one of the core centers of late capitalism. So it seems to me sometimes that what they're looking for is an alternative blueprint to neoliberalism, like just an alternative neoliberalism, not really an escape from it. And ironically, not really an escape from the West either. I mean, they claim they want to escape the West, but what really attracts them to Dubai is that it's familiar, right? It's a familiar Western life form. That's what it is. And that's why they go there and not, I don't know, some other place that they could possibly go to, right?
Yeah, I mean, you've got some people I have met who decided to do a hijrah a bit more consciously to, Andalusia or Jordan or Tunisia, with this idea of creating a small village and starting things from scratch outside of the system, with all sorts of challenges, of course. But again, I cannot say if it's the right solution or they can do better. I don't know, but I think it's another end of the spectrum of this same kind of romanticization of, am I saying it right? Romanticization?
Yeah, romanticization, yeah.
Romanticization, yeah, of the East and wanting to escape. Escape, yes, but we don't exactly know what and to where. And also, I think a lot has to do with a certain understanding of what Islam is, because now you have the UAE, but now there's a growing trend of moving to Malaysia or Indonesia. But again, these are not perfect countries. They may provide, again, this sense of familiarity because like everything is halal and like you have the adhan on the streets and so on. But yeah, I don't know if it's the right solution. What I wanted to say on this point is that, yeah, there is an understanding of Islam that has been transmitted to many people, and in a very reductionist way, in the sense that a lot of people understand Islam as like, some codes and rituals to perform more than a philosophy, more than a framework, a guideline for life. And so people who have been growing up with this understanding of Islam reduced to, rituals, halal, haram, of course, this is something for them that's going to be no question. Where it's going to be very appealing because you have all the comforts of your Western lifestyle, but with a halal stamp on it. And people don't think that there's like maybe further implications. And maybe, what if, our responsibility was actually in the countries we were born in and for the people around us to change the things with the resources we have, with the knowledge we have, instead of, fleeing away. These are open questions. I don't have the right answer for that. But, this is one theory I have, that maybe, this reductionist understanding of Islam also is what people pushes people to, make these moves, have these ideas without questioning things twice.
So, okay, one thing I wanted to discuss, you have a YouTube channel. Could you tell us maybe about the aims and purposes of your channel and what you were kind of hoping to achieve by having a YouTube channel?
Yeah, so my YouTube channel is and has always been something very experimental. Because my first question when I entered the academic industry was, how can I make my knowledge of practical use for people? And I very much consider that my knowledge is not valid unless it is shared and it is useful for people. Just like, I consider I have to pay zakat on my wealth. I consider my YouTube channel and my productions as a zakat on my knowledge. And because I am very much aware that not everyone has the time and the resources to read journal articles, to read and buy books. So my question was, how can I make my findings accessible to people who do not have access to these resources, who don't have the time to read books and stuff? Plus, we can talk about how the academic industry is just, it's like a giant gatekeeping exercise. Like knowledge is not produced for it to be useful, to be spread, like disseminated to people. So this is how I started. And, I've experimented with lots of different things. I've experimented with, a documentary style. I've made some satirical videos. And then, I decided on just, plain, simple, informative videos, me speaking on camera and, see how it goes. Because the tricky thing is that there's no one content form that is going to be like a silver bullet, is going to speak to everyone. Everyone has different preferences. Everyone has different, I would say, likes to gather knowledge in many different ways. So a satirical video might speak to some people who, really wanted this form of content, but some people just, respond more to a long form podcast style interview with someone who is actually doing the work. So yeah, I can't say I have found the perfect recipe, but this is again an intention of mine, because I also realized that, YouTube is, it's a very random space, the internet. Sometimes you can produce something, a video off the cuff without any plan, any script that can gather like hundreds of thousands of views. And a video you put a lot of work in is going to only be seen by 30 people. And I still don't understand how it works. But my intention, because it can be very distressing, when you put a lot of work and you see it doesn't yield the results you were expecting or you wished for. I'm just telling myself I'm planting seeds. These videos are going to be out there, and I just pray it benefits like whoever stumbles upon it. And I've got people who, message me, email me about a video I've released maybe 8 years ago. Wow, I found your video. It really helped my understanding of things. This is where I think, it's not about quantity. It's not about numbers. But just like, we have this tradition saying that if you save one life, you save the whole of humanity. For me, if one video changed the life of one person, that's mission accomplished.
So a couple of semesters ago, I was struck by some of the feedback I got from students, at the end of semester feedback, where they described the lectures as content. They said, I enjoy this content, I don't enjoy that content. And then it just got me thinking, are academics simply content creators? And is this transition to YouTube, it's another manifestation of what you're talking about when you talk about neoliberalism, where we are all content creators now and we're competing for the attention span of different people.
Yeah, that's a very gloomy way of seeing it. I think, students just adopt whatever vocabulary they stumble upon. But yeah, I think, what we are seeing more and more, like realistically in the academic industry, is there maybe the Uberization of academics. Now it's going to be everyone for themselves. And yeah, we're going to have, 5-star ratings. I mean, there's already websites that provide, rating for academics. It's crazy. But, it's, I think the big challenge is trying to cut down the noise. Because I see these things as distraction. What is my job in the first place is, spreading a message, telling stories, sharing all the wonderful, inspiring stories about the people who are actually doing the work on the ground to other people I meet in my journey. And yeah, not trying to rely on this, but on these like ratings and figures and like what people say, because I've got some really horrible comments about people, sometimes about stupid things, about like, or, people who just completely disagree with these views with, the things I may say, with some other people have said. And, it's just, I just had to come to the conclusion that I'm not doing the work for everyone, but for whoever will benefit from it. And that's it. We cannot please everyone. We cannot be, what we're going to say is not going to fall into the ears and the minds of everyone. And this is the reality of life. This is the reality of the human condition. So, just carry on, check our intentions, do the best to give it our best shot, given our current resources and abilities. And, the impact is, in the end, not in our hands.
In one of your recent videos, you broke the news that you are going to be leaving academia. So could you perhaps speak a little bit to what brought you to that decision? We're obviously all feeling the kind of pressures of the global academic job market at the moment. And perhaps could you also share some advice for others who are either thinking about transitioning out of academia, particularly those in the humanities and social sciences, which seem to be the kind of first affected by these kinds of pressures?
Yeah. So at the moment, I feel that, there is good positions. So I know of maybe like one or two people who are in a relatively okay position at university. So, but the thing is, for the majority of people who want to think about an academic career, this is not going to be the case. Universities, which provide a decent compensation, decent work hours, and a good environment for academics, are becoming the exception more than the rule. And this is a realization that I made years ago, but I just wanted to finish all the work I had to do relative to my book and my YouTube channel, like this big research project, before saying goodbye to academia. Because the reality is, when it comes to my personal life, but like my own physical and mental health, but also the health of my family, it is just not sustainable. Because in my case, I was doing maybe 100, 110 hours a week. And most of it was admin. It was not reading. It was not research. It was not interviewing people, doing field work. It was not writing. It was admin, ticking boxes, random data privacy training, filling forms, asking for authorizations, like email chains. What kind of work is that, if you will? And the compensation absolutely didn't follow, in the sense that for that number of hours, if I was working as a waiter in a restaurant, paid minimum wage, I would be paid double the salary I was paid as an academic. Plus, 99% of the people around me are stuck in temporary contracts. It's, 6 months, maximum 1 year temporary contract. And then either you need to chase grant after grant after grant if you want to keep your position, or if you're lucky enough to get a permanent job at the end. The problem is, how you're going to be exploited. In the words of an academic I really admire and is one of the miracles I've witnessed in the industry, Suad Abdul Khabir, University of Michigan. So she calls the academic industry the plantation. And I feel, this like it hits the nail. This is like academics are just, products to be like milked, exploited. It's not about knowledge anymore. So, from all perspectives, compensation, work hours, mental health, physical health, sustainability, because as humans, we all crave some kind of stability, some kind of visibility in the future. But academia doesn't give any of these anymore, apart from maybe a few exceptions. So that's the logical answer, And again, taking example on Suad Abdul Khabir, I don't believe that academia is the sole way of disseminating knowledge. First, if we understand academia as, another like colonial / hegemonic industry, like gatekeeping of knowledge, there are other ways. And I think, watching her as, doing live performances or like visual arts, it really reinforced the idea in me that, if I want to try to disseminate knowledge, I can do YouTube, I can do social media, or even, offline. I have so many community initiatives around me with whom I can do projects. So, for example, we were talking about, the Muslim Red Pill now with the Rumi's Cave, a community hub in North London. So I've started last Ramadan men's outdoor club, and every month we have different activities with it, whether it is, bushcrafting, kayaking, hiking, fly pigeon shooting, these kind of things. There's many, many other ways of, as I say, being a steward for people around us.
There are always more questions, but I think we can probably call it a day. We've covered a nice amount of ground.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. William, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, we do hope you enjoyed this episode, and we welcome your comments, feedback, and suggestions. Please do send us an email at proteanview@muftah.org. We'd love to hear from you. Whether you're listening to this on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, we'd really appreciate a 5-star review or a like. This helps improve the visibility of the show. With your support, we can keep Protean View running and gradually improve it. Visit us at muftah.org and navigate to the Protean View tab to see all our episodes, and follow us on our socials using the handle @ProteanView, including on Patreon, where you can become a paid patron and receive exclusive content. Until next time.